The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, before I had poured my first cup of coffee. The display read Nashville's First Federal, Fraud Division, and something cold moved through my chest before I even answered. I had spent 31 years as a forensic accountant. I knew what a fraud division call at 6:47 in the morning meant. I picked up. The woman on the line was professional and measured, with the careful manner of someone who has already had a very bad morning and is bracing for the conversation to get worse. She asked me to verify my identity. I did. Then she told me there had been an unusual transaction flagged on an account linked to my residential property. A home equity line of credit opened in my name. A wire transfer processed the previous afternoon. $310,000 sent to a private dump business account registered in Delaware. I set the mug down on the granite counter. Outside, the first pale light was just beginning to reach over the tree line, and the Japanese maple my wife had planted in the front yard was barely visible through the kitchen window, its new spring leaves catching no color yet. I asked the woman one question. Was the independent co-trustee authorization on file when that transaction cleared? A pause. Not a thinking pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone realizes, in real time, that a routine fraud call has just become something considerably larger than they were prepared for. Sir, she said, her voice dropping a full register, we have no record of any co-trustee authorization on this account. I told her to freeze the wire immediately and not release a single cent pending a full review. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stood at my kitchen counter in the early morning quiet and understood, with the clean, cold certainty of a man who has spent his career finding what other people hide, that my son-in-law had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. He had no idea yet. My name is not important to this story. What matters is what I was, 64 years old, retired, and a widower of 18 months. I had worked 3 decades catching financial fraud for a private forensic accounting firm that contracted with federal agencies and corporate litigation teams. I had testified in 11 federal cases. I had watched men in expensive suits cry in courtrooms when juries came back with verdicts. I had helped build from nothing but paper and arithmetic. I knew exactly how people hid money. I knew exactly how they stole it. I had simply never expected to need that knowledge to protect myself from my own daughter. I bought the house in Sylvan Park in 1991, the year she was born. My wife and I paid it off in 2014, the year she turned 42 and began talking seriously about what we wanted the rest of our lives to look like. It was a craftsman-style house on a quiet street, 2 stories. A front porch that caught the afternoon light, a yard my wife had been refining since the day we moved in. She planted the Japanese maple that first spring. She planted climbing roses along the back fence the following year. She had plans for the side yard that she never finished, and after she was gone, I left that stretch of ground alone because it felt like the truest kind of monument. My wife passed from ovarian cancer in September of the year before last. We had been married 33 years. My son-in-law had come into our lives 8 years earlier, introduced at a birthday dinner. He was 44 now, well-dressed in the particular way of men who spend their days discussing other people's money. Fitted shirts, a watch that cost more than my first car, the comfortable confidence of someone who had always been able to talk his way into the right rooms. He ran a wealth management consulting firm out of an office on Charlotte Avenue in Nashville. He had a gift for making complicated financial arrangements sound both reasonable and urgent, which is the most dangerous combination in the English language. My daughter believed he was brilliant. I had always found him a shade too comfortable explaining things he only partially understood. My daughter was 38. She had worked as a real estate paralegal at a mid-sized Nashville firm for nearly a decade. She knew property transactions the way some people know a language they grew up speaking, automatically, deeply, without having to think about the mechanics. She understood lien filings, deed structures, and the precise legal weight of a signed power of attorney document. She was careful, methodical, and when she decided she wanted something, she had inherited her mother's patience for the long approach. I did not put those 2 facts together until it was almost too late. The scheme began, as betrayals of this kind always do, disguised as a crisis. It was a Sunday evening in February. Ice on the roads, sleet coming in sideways off the Cumberland. I was in the living room with a book when headlights swept across the wall and their SUV pulled into the driveway. My daughter came through the door first, her coat soaked through, her eyes already red-rimmed in a way that meant she had been crying for some time before arriving. My son-in-law followed with his shoulders set in the posture of a man performing exhaustion. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. That is what you do. My son-in-law sat at the table and described, in organized, fluent detail, that the IRS had opened an audit of his consulting firm 3 weeks prior. A former client had filed a complaint. The audit had triggered an automatic freeze on his primary business accounts while his attorneys worked to resolve the matter. A significant liability payment was due at the end of the week. If he could not demonstrate to the auditors that the firm had substantial underlying assets, real, tangible collateral, not just accounts receivable, the firm would be placed in receivership. They would lose the business, possibly the house. My daughter pressed her hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I had last seen on her face when she was 9 years old and had broken something irreplaceable. "Dad," she said quietly, "we don't know who else we can ask." I offered immediately to write them a personal check. I had liquid savings. I told them I could have funds transferred within 48 hours. My son-in-law shook his head with what appeared to be genuine reluctance. Personal funds wouldn't satisfy the IRS requirement, he explained. What auditors needed to see was a declared asset, real property, clear title, no outstanding encumbrances, formally associated with the firm's financial profile. What he was proposing was a durable financial power of attorney, narrow in scope, 90 days in duration, naming him as my authorized representative for the sole purpose of listing the property as a supporting asset in the audit response. Nothing about my day-to-day life would change. Nothing about ownership would change. Once the audit resolved, his attorneys would file the termination paperwork, and it would be as though the document had never existed. It was a convincing presentation. He used the right terms in the right order. He made the underlying logic sound routine. Then my daughter leaned forward and touched my hand, and in a voice so soft I had to lean toward her to hear it, she said, "Mom always said you were the strongest man she knew. She made me promise to come to you if we were ever truly in trouble." There is a particular cruelty in weaponizing grief that fresh. I was aware, in some clinical corner of my mind, of exactly what she was doing. I had watched corporate attorneys do it to witnesses on the stand, find the wound, press it, redirect the emotion before rational analysis could reassert itself. I signed the paperwork anyway, because she was my daughter, and because the man who had spent 30 years reading financial documents behind a desk had been temporarily replaced by the man who had spent 30 years being her father. I did not read page 11. This is the part I have to sit with the longest. In 31 years of forensic accounting, I had caught exactly this technique in 7 separate fraud cases. A stack of documents with the operative clause buried in the middle, surrounded by dense, legitimate boilerplate that numbs a reader into compliance. I had written training materials about it. I had explained it to junior associates as the single most common mechanism in white-collar property theft. And I still missed it, because I was looking at my daughter's face. Page 11 did not authorize my son-in-law to list my property as supporting documentation on an IRS filing. It authorized him to open secured financial instruments against the property, home equity lines of credit, mortgages, any secured lending vehicle, on my behalf at his sole discretion, without requiring any further approval from me. The IRS audit framing was a detail. Page 11 was the point. 3 weeks after I signed, he walked into Nashville First Federal with my POA document and opened a $350,000 home equity line of credit against my paid-off house. Within 30 days, he had drawn $310,000 from it and wired the funds to a Delaware LLC account he controlled through a third-party holding company, with no visible connection to his consulting firm's registered name. I found out the way I find out everything, through paper. I have kept paper statements my entire adult life. Old habit from my early years in the field, when I had seen too many digital records quietly altered and retamped. The HELOC statement arrived in a plain white envelope on a Thursday afternoon in late March, and I nearly set it aside, assuming it was promotional mail. Something made me open it instead. Some reflex so ingrained I no longer consciously recognize it, the same instinct that has made me reach for anomalies, the way other people reach for doorknobs. I read it at the kitchen table. I read it a second time. Then I set it flat on the granite surface and looked out the window at the Japanese maple, which was in the first week of leafing out, the way it did every March, the way my wife had watched it do every March for 28 years. I sat there for a long time. I did not call my daughter. I did not call my son-in-law. I walked to the living room and sat in my armchair and ran the data the way I had run data for 3 decades. Slowly, without emotion, treating the information as a structural problem rather than a personal one. My son-in-law had purchased a 42-foot cabin cruiser, moored at Percy Priest Lake. I had seen it in January at a gathering they had invited me to. Their rental house had undergone a complete kitchen renovation in February and March, new cabinetry and hardwood floors throughout, the kind of work that ran $60,000 to $80,000. My daughter had appeared at church 2 weeks ago in a wool overcoat I recognized as a brand that retailed at over $1,000. Neither of them had mentioned any of these purchases as anything other than the natural rewards of a business doing well. A business that, 6 weeks earlier, had been described to me as days from collapse. I got up, went to the kitchen, and called Quentin Morse. Quentin had been my counterpart on 3 federal fraud cases in the 90s, working the litigation side while I built the financial evidence. He had retired from the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2008 and opened a private forensic litigation practice on 2nd Avenue that had, in the intervening years, become the kind of firm that other firms called when a case was complicated enough to matter. He answered his own cell phone, which told me I had caught him between meetings. I told him I needed 45 minutes, and that the matter involved federal bank fraud against a federally insured institution. He told me to come in Friday morning. I sat across from him 2 days later with a copy of the HELOC statement, the POA document, and a timeline I had written out by hand on 3 pages of legal paper. Quentin rolled of it without asking a single question. When he finished, he looked up at me. "The trust," he said, not a question. He knew how people like me thought. "Tell me about the trust." In October of 2019, 6 weeks after my wife's diagnosis, and before the first surgery, we had retained an estate planning attorney in Brentwood, with whom we had no prior relationship, and who had no connection to my son-in-law's business networks. We had been deliberate about the choice. My wife knew our daughter's financial history, 2 failed ventures in her late 20s, a period of credit card debt she had never fully acknowledged to us, a pattern of wanting things before she had the foundation to support them. We did not want that history to reach the house after we were both gone. What we established was an irrevocable living trust, and built into the trust instrument was a single specific condition: any financial instrument secured against the trust property, any line of credit, any mortgage, any lien of any kind, required not only the signature of the named trustee, which was me, but the independent countersignature of a co-trustee. That co-trustee was a woman who had been my wife's closest friend since law school. She lived in Knoxville. She had never met my son-in-law. That authorization had never been obtained. The co-trustee had never been contacted. My son-in-law had never known she existed because he had never asked, because he had assumed that a signed power of attorney was the last word on the subject, and because he had never imagined that a confused, aging widower might have had the foresight to build a wall he couldn't see. Quentin set his pen down very deliberately. "The HELOC is void," he said. "A power of attorney has no authority over trust property. The document your son-in-law presented to Nashville First Federal was legally insufficient to open a secured lending instrument against that house. The bank has no lien. The $310,000 he withdrew was obtained by presenting fraudulent documentation to a federally insured institution." He paused. "That is textbook federal bank fraud, aggravated by the wire transfer to the LLC. Your son-in-law is not looking at a civil dispute, my friend. He is looking at a federal indictment." I nodded. I had already known. But there is something different about hearing a man who has put people in federal prison say it plainly in a quiet room. I told Quentin I wanted them to feel completely safe until the moment they no longer were. For 6 weeks, I played a man I had never been. I called my daughter more frequently than usual, making small remarks about misplaced glasses and forgotten appointments. I asked my son-in-law to help me reset a computer password I knew perfectly well. I left my truck parked at a slightly wrong angle in the driveway 2 days running. My daughter started bringing casseroles on Sundays. My son-in-law came by once midweek, let himself in with the spare key they had asked for, in case of an emergency, and spent a few minutes in my study, glancing at the shelves with the benign curiosity of someone surveying real estate they believe they have already purchased. I watched him from the hallway. He never noticed me. Meanwhile, Quentin's team traced the wire transfer through 4 accounts to the Delaware LLC brokerage. They documented every major expenditure: the boat, the renovation, the travel, the coat. They prepared a federal filing of 61 pages, including a referral to the FBI's white-collar division. And then I wore a recording device to Sunday dinner. My son-in-law had hosted what he called a business milestone celebration. I arrived with a bottle of wine I did not intend to drink, and a button-sized audio recorder that Quentin's office had arranged through proper legal channels in cooperation with the FBI. My son-in-law was expansive all evening, talking about the firm's projected growth and a property he was evaluating in the Bahamas. My daughter kept my wine glass full and asked me twice whether I was sleeping well. I declined her offer to drive me home afterward, kissed her on the cheek, and walked to my car. I was 2 blocks away when the recording captured what I needed. My daughter's voice, clear through the dining room she thought was empty, telling my son-in-law that they needed to accelerate the process of moving the HELOC funds offshore before the 90-day POA window expired and drew scrutiny. My son-in-law's response, relaxed, almost casual, that by the time anything surfaced I would be too far along in my decline to mount a coherent challenge, and that they should probably start researching memory care facilities in the area so the transition would look natural when the time came. My daughter's laugh, small, almost affectionate. That sound cost her everything that followed. The FBI agents arrived at my son-in-law's office on a Tuesday at 9:15 in the morning, presented a federal warrant, and informed him that his accounts were being frozen pending a criminal investigation into bank fraud and wire fraud charges. His paralegal called me 40 minutes later, shaking, because she had worked for him for 4 years and genuinely had not known. My daughter called me at 10. Her voice had shed every trace of the warmth she had maintained for 6 weeks. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said the situation was being handled by attorneys and would be resolved quickly. She said she hoped I hadn't done anything that couldn't be undone. "Dad," she said finally, "you owe me this." I thought about what I owed her. I thought about the year she was 7, standing at the bottom of the stairs in a Halloween costume, asking me with complete seriousness whether I thought she was brave. I thought about the night she graduated from college and cried in the parking lot because she was afraid she wasn't ready for anything that came next, and I stood with her in the dark and told her she was more ready than she knew. I thought about my wife's face in the hospital room, asking me to keep the promises that mattered. "I don't owe you anything," I said quietly. "You borrowed against my house to buy a boat." I drove to Charlotte Avenue. My son-in-law was in the parking lot when I arrived, standing beside his car while a federal agent reviewed documents on a clipboard. He saw me from 50 feet away. Whatever he had prepared himself for, my confusion, my grief, some last-minute intervention on his behalf, he had not prepared for what he saw coming across that parking lot. I walked toward him the way I had walked into courtrooms for 30 years, and when I stopped in front of him, his face had gone the gray of old concrete. "You never asked about the trust structure," I said. "You assumed the power of attorney was the final word. It wasn't. A POA has no authority over trust property. The house never moved. I let that land. You presented a void document to a federally insured bank and drew $310,000 against an asset you had no legal claim to. That is not a family disagreement. That is a federal crime, and you have known exactly what you were doing since the night you sat at my kitchen table and told me about an IRS audit that never existed." He looked at me for a moment and then looked away. My daughter arrived 20 minutes later. She sat in her car across the lot for a long time before she got out. When she walked toward me, she moved slowly, and when she was close enough that I could see her face clearly, I understood that the woman who had brought me casseroles and refilled my wine glass and asked me whether I was sleeping well had been, throughout all of it, performing a role with a specific outcome in mind. I had simply been unwilling to see it, because she was my daughter, and I had spent 38 years choosing to see something better. "Please," she said. Her voice broke on the word. "I know what I did. I know what we did. But you're my father. I'm asking you to stop this." I looked at her for a long time. Your mother made me promise to protect what she built, I said. That's what I did. I turned around and walked back to my car. Behind me, my daughter sank onto the curb and began crying in a way that was not performed and was not small. Across the lot, a federal agent finished handcuffing my son-in-law and walked him toward a vehicle without ceremony or particular urgency, the way that people do when the paperwork is already complete and the outcome was determined weeks ago. I did not look back. The drive home took 23 minutes. I went through the neighborhoods I had traveled for 30 years, past the church on 42nd, past the old hardware store that was now a coffee shop, down the familiar slope of the hill that had always given my stomach a slight lift, a sensation so ingrained that I stopped noticing it somewhere around 2004, and only noticed its absence now, when I was paying attention to everything. The house came into view, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going in. The Japanese maple was in full leaf. The afternoon light came through it at the particular angle it reached in late spring, turning the leaves a dozen slightly different shades of green, and for a moment, just a moment, I could almost believe it was a Tuesday like any other Tuesday, that my wife might be in the kitchen, that the worst things that had happened in the past 18 months were still in the future. I went up the porch steps and sat in the wooden chair I had occupied every quiet evening for 30 years. The street was calm. Down the block, a neighbor's sprinkler turned in slow arcs across a front lawn. The sun was going flat and red through the tree line to the west, the same view my wife had looked at from this chair on 10,000 evenings. The house was mine. The trust was intact. The deed was clean. I had not wanted a war. I had wanted exactly this. A porch, an evening, the tree my wife planted still standing where she put it. I had wanted to be left alone to keep the promises that mattered to the only person I had ever made them to. My son-in-law and my daughter had decided that was worth stealing. They had looked at what I had built and loved and calculated its dollar value and decided their comfort was more important than my life. They had been wrong about the only thing that mattered. The light failed slowly, the way it does in May in Tennessee, reluctant and warm. I sat until the street lamps came on. Then I picked up the empty mug I had carried out from the kitchen, went inside, and locked the door behind me. The house settled around me in the quiet. I turned off the light.